Ever find yourself kind of, debating with yourself in your head, like, should I have that extra cup of coffee, or what's the meaning of life? Those big questions. We experience this as just like this flurry of thoughts,
Yeah.
ideas that are kind of separate from our senses.
Right. Yep.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's a pretty common
Hmm.
experience. And philosophers, they've actually given this kind of thought a name. They call it amodal, which basically means it's separate from our senses, like sight or sound.
A modal. So like the opposite of our senses in a way.
Yeah.
But what if this whole way we think about thinking, what if it's wrong?
Well, that's exactly the kind of provocative question that cognitive scientist Peter Carruthers is posing in his research. He's really challenging this traditional view, this idea of a modal thought. He's proposing this idea that actually reflection, thinking things through, it's not driven by these abstract thoughts, but by our sensory experiences.
So instead of like, just pondering these big questions with just like pure thought, we're actually relying on our senses. Okay. I'm intrigued, but I have to admit I'm also a little confused.
It does seem kind of counterintuitive at first, but Carruthers' argument, it all boils down to this idea that the abstract concepts we think we're working with, they're actually represented in our brain through our senses, through sensory information.
Okay. So how does that even work? If we're not reflecting with these abstract thoughts,
Hmm.
then what is going on in our minds when we think?
Well, let's think about something like understanding speech. Like imagine you're listening to a language you've never heard before.
Oh, okay. I could picture that just like a jumble of unfamiliar sounds.
Exactly. You can hear the sounds, but they don't have any meaning to you yet.
Right. Because you haven't connected those sounds with a concept. So you're only experiencing the actual sound, the auditory sensations, but not the deeper meaning.
So there's this difference between the actual sensory input, like hearing the sounds, and then grasping the meaning, like understanding what those sounds
Yeah,
represent.
exactly. And Carruthers thinks this idea applies to way more than just language. He believes we don't actually reflect directly on these abstract concepts. We experience them through our senses. Even for things we consider to be abstract, like justice or infinity, we're still relying on sensory information that's stored in our brain. So it's like, instead of our thoughts being these separate things, they're kind of formed and shaped by our senses.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost as if um, it's like our thoughts are reflections, but on a pond, and our senses are creating ripples on the surface of the water.
Yeah, it's a really interesting way to put it. Yeah. It suggests that our experience of thinking is maybe a lot more connected to our physical selves than we realize.
Yeah, it is. That's a pretty big shift in thinking. So then how does he explain, like, how our thought process actually works? If these abstract thoughts aren't really the main players, then what is?
Well, Carruthers, he points out that even when we feel like we're having these abstract thoughts, there's always this sensory component happening underneath. Think about like talking to yourself in your head, right? You're basically experiencing this kind of like auditory imagination.
Yeah, that inner monologue, we've all got that running commentary going on.
And that's exactly what he's talking about. He argues that this inner speech, this inner monologue, along with other sensory experiences like imagining images, this is really what forms the basis of how we reflect and think.
So these sensory experiences, they're like a bridge to those more hidden, abstract
Yeah,
concepts.
yeah. That's a really fascinating idea. And to understand it a bit better, let's maybe dive into some specific examples that Carruthers uses. He has some really compelling ones. It's like those scrub jays we were talking about before. Remember the birds that hide their
Oh,
snacks?
yeah, yeah, those avian masterminds with their little hidden food stashes.
Yeah. Exactly. So they're actually a really good example of how sensory experiences might be tied to what seems like abstract thought. Studies show that these birds, they don't just remember where they hid a tasty treat, but they also remember what type of food it was and how long ago they hid it.
Wow, so they're not just remembering a location, they're like keeping track of time and what kind of food it was. That's pretty impressive.
It is impressive.
Right.
Right. And it seems to suggest a level of planning and memory that goes way beyond just, like a simple stimulus response kind of thing. Carruthers argues this might be evidence of a modal concepts at work.
So even our bird brains are forming these concepts about different types of food and how much time has passed, all through these experiences they have with their senses, like foraging and stashing food away.
Yeah.
Okay, so that makes sense for scrub jays and snacks. But what about, something as complex as human memory? How does that fit into all of this?
Well, Carruthers believes that episodic memories, those really vivid memories we have of past experiences, he thinks they hold an important clue.
Okay.
Because these memories aren't just abstract facts, are they? They involve re-experiencing sights, sounds, emotions, the whole nine yards.
Right. You're basically reliving it in your mind.
Exactly. It's like we're reactivating sensory information that's stored away in our brains.
Okay, so there's definitely like a sensory component to episodic memory. We're not just remembering like the dry facts. We're almost putting ourselves back in that moment.
Yeah.
Okay. But how does this support, his idea that even reflection, like our conscious thought processes, rely on sensory experiences?
Well, he's basically saying that reflection works in a very similar way. So when we reflect on something, we're not just like pulling up a cold, hard fact. We're actually reactivating all those sensory pathways that are related to that experience, even if it's just happening internally.
So like if I'm thinking back on a conversation I had, I might actually almost hear snippets of the dialogue in my head, or maybe feel like a hint of the emotions that I felt at the time.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And just like those scrub jays and their snacks, our brains are always working in the background, making these connections between what we experience with our senses and the bigger concepts that they represent.
It's all starting to make a little more sense now. But is there, is there any hard evidence from neuroscience that backs this up? Because it's a pretty big claim.
Oh, absolutely. He doesn't just rely on, thought experiments and observations of animal behavior. He's got some hard science to back him up.
Okay.
And one really important piece of evidence comes from research on attention and working memory.
Okay, so how do those two things, attention and working memory, how do they fit into this whole idea of thought being based on the senses?
Well, just think about it. At any given moment, we are just bombarded with sensory information. I mean, sights, sounds, smells. It's overwhelming.
Sensory overload, it's real.
Right. And our brains, they're amazing filters. They help us focus on what's important at that moment, and that's attention at work. And then what we choose to focus on, those sensory experiences, they get held in our working memory, which is kind of like our brain's little mental workspace.
So it's like attention is like a spotlight, and our working memory is the stage where all the important stuff gets highlighted.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
Okay.
So here's where it gets really interesting. Brain imaging studies, they've actually shown that even when we're doing these really abstract tasks like solving a problem or thinking about a philosophical question, areas of our brain that are associated with processing sensory information, they're still active.
So even when I'm trying to wrap my head around some really complex, abstract idea, my brain isn't just like off in its own little world of thought. It's still relying on those sensory areas to do the work.
That seems to be the case. And Carruthers argues this is because our working memory, the place where we're actually processing information, is inherently sensory-based. It deals with information that's encoded through those senses that we were talking about.
Okay, so even our most abstract thoughts are still, at their core, connected to our sensory experiences. This is pretty mind-blowing stuff.
It is.
But if our working memory can only really deal with information from our senses, how do we even begin to think about things that don't have a direct sensory counterpart? Like things like justice or infinity.
That's a great question, and it's one that Carruthers definitely addresses.
Yeah.
He says that even these super abstract concepts, they're actually grounded in our sensory experiences. We learn them by interacting with the world around us through our senses.
So even though those abstract concepts don't have like a specific sight or sound or smell or whatever, they're still built on a foundation of all those different sensory experiences we have.
Exactly. Think about the concept of justice. We're not born with some innate understanding of what justice is, right? Yeah.
We learn about it through stories, observing how people interact, by experiencing fairness and unfairness ourselves. And it's all of these experiences that eventually lay the groundwork for us to understand what that abstract concept even means.
So we're building up these complex, abstract concepts over time, piece by piece, based on all these little sensory encounters that we have with the world.
Yeah. And Carruthers believes that those sensory building blocks, they're always there, even when we're thinking about the concept in a more abstract way. Even if we're not consciously aware of them. It's kind of like, think about those really intricate structures people build with Legos.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
You might not always see those individual Legos, right?
Right.
But they're still there. They're holding the whole thing together.
Yeah.
Yeah. So even when we're thinking about something as abstract as infinity, we're still drawing on those past sensory experiences. Like maybe we picture this huge expanse or just something that never ends.
Yeah. Exactly.
This is really changing how I think about thinking. It seems like it's a lot more grounded in our physical bodies, in what we experience with our senses, than I ever realized before.
Yeah. And that realization, it actually leads to some really interesting questions, not just about how our own minds work, but also about the minds of animals.
Yeah, that's what I've been wondering this whole time. We keep coming back to this idea of animal minds. So how does this theory change how we think about, how animals think?
Well, for a really long time, there's been this assumption that humans are unique because we have this, like, monopoly on abstract thought. We have language. We can reason in complex ways. We make elaborate plans for the future.
Right, all the things that supposedly set us apart from animals.
Right, exactly. But Carruthers is suggesting we rethink that whole paradigm. Because if abstract thought is really rooted in these sensory experiences, then suddenly that line between human minds and animal minds, it doesn't seem so clear anymore.
So are you saying that animals might actually be capable of abstract thought too?
Carruthers doesn't think we should rule it out.
Wow.
He argues that humans and animals, we both use these amodal representations, those underlying concepts. The difference, he says, might not be in whether we have these concepts or not, but in how we use them.
So it's not like a black and white difference. It's more like a spectrum of cognitive abilities.
Exactly. So humans might use those concepts in ways that are more, sophisticated or flexible thanks to language and other tools that we have. But those basic building blocks of thought, those modal representations, they could be shared across species.
Wow, that is incredible. It's like we're getting this little peek into the secret lives of animal minds. But, okay, you need some concrete examples. What kind of evidence do we have that animals might actually be using these amodal concepts in ways that, we haven't really recognized before? So we've got these like hints that animals might be using these amodal concepts, these building blocks of abstract thought. But like, what kind of evidence are we actually talking about here?
Well, Carruthers points to a lot of the research on animal behavior, especially studies that look at things like memory and planning. Remember those scrub jays?
Yeah.
And how they're so good at stashing their food?
Right, the ones that remember not just where they hid the food, but what kind it was and how long it's been.
Exactly. That's a perfect example of what I'm talking about because those birds, they're demonstrating this grasp of different types of food and the passage of time. Those are concepts. They go way beyond just basic spatial memory.
Yeah, it's like they have their own little mental calendar for their snacks. It's kind of mind-boggling when you really think about it. All those connections happening in their little bird brains.
It is pretty remarkable. And this type of research, it really forces us to reconsider what we think we know about animal intelligence. Maybe we've been underestimating what other species are capable of all along.
It's like we're finally starting to break down these barriers that we've put up between ourselves and other animals.
And that's actually one of the most exciting things about Carruthers' work, I think. It encourages us to consider this bigger continuity of consciousness throughout the entire animal kingdom.
Yeah. It is. It's humbling in a way to think that we might not have this total monopoly on abstract thought, but it's also kind of awe-inspiring when you think about it. Like, what kind of rich inner lives might exist in the minds of other animals?
It really is incredible when you think about it that way.
It really makes you appreciate the intricacy of all life on Earth. This has been an incredible journey, I guess you could say. But I have to admit, I feel like it's raised more questions than it's answered. Like, if our thoughts are so connected to our senses, then where does that leave, free will?
That is the big question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And Carruthers' theory, it doesn't necessarily say that free will doesn't exist, but it definitely makes us think about it in a whole new way.
Yeah, because if our conscious thoughts are being shaped by these, like, unconscious processes that are driven by our senses, then what does that even mean for the choices we make? Are we really in control, or are we just, like, along for the ride?
It's a really profound question, and there are no easy answers. Even Carruthers himself, he wrestles with these implications in his work. He even suggests that our conscious experience might actually be more of a consequence of what's happening, rather than the cause.
So you're saying we might think we're making this conscious decision, but actually that decision has already been made by these unconscious processes that we're not even aware of? Wow. That's a lot to take in.
It really challenges how we see ourselves, doesn't it? Like this idea that we're these perfectly rational beings who are in total control of everything we think and do.
Right.
But it's a challenge that I think is really important. It forces us to really examine, the very nature of consciousness, but from this new perspective.
This whole deep dive, it's been quite a journey. We've gone from questioning how we think to, like, pondering the nature of consciousness and free will, and even gotten this glimpse into the minds of animals.
It really shows you how connected everything is, doesn't it? Exploring just this one aspect of the mind can lead to all these other unexpected discoveries about ourselves and the world around us.
Well, it's definitely giving you a lot to think about. It's like Carruthers has given us this whole new lens to look through, not just for understanding our own minds, but the minds of, like, all creatures.
Absolutely. And that's what's so great about scientific inquiry, right?
Yeah.
Each new discovery opens up all these new avenues for exploration, which hopefully leads us to this deeper understanding of the universe and our place in it.
Well, I think we've given our listeners plenty to ponder for now. It's been another fascinating deep dive. And remember, keep those minds open and never stop questioning.